So what I'm going to do now for 15 minutes is to present some work. This is joint work. It's carried out in conjunction with Nina Taft from Google and Satya and Brandon from CMU. And it's myself and Sarah at Lancaster. And this is a position paper, really. It's a thought piece. There's some work that's gone into understanding the domain and understanding the requirements and the architecture we're proposing, but there's no implementation behind it. And that means two things. It means if you're expecting graphs, you're going to be very disappointed. But it also means that if you have constructive ideas and criticism and feedback, we really like to hear it now because it's not too late. We can actually fix things before we start building. So we're looking forward to engagement and questions. And the paper is kind of trying to tackle a problem of privacy in the Internet of Things. Just in case Roy isn't listening, that's the Internet of Things, again. And it's privacy mediation and trying to address privacy concerns in the IoT. Right? So lots and lots of hype around the Internet of Things. If you want to get money from industry now, this is fantastic. You just need to write Internet of Things in your grant proposals, and life is good. I might be getting cynical in my old age, but you can get a lot of traction now by framing things in terms of the Internet of Things. But one of the observations that we had was that despite all of the promise, despite all of the hype, it's not clear actually that the IoT as it stands at the moment is going to get over this so-called adoption chasm. And the point here is that when a new technology emerges, essentially the early adopters will take it on board almost whatever. Right? It's cool, it's funky, let's go. Bring it on. For the rest of us, we kind of look at it and actually think, well, what is this technology really offering me? What's the value proposition? And what are the blockers? What are the obstacles? Why don't I want this new technology? And you have to tackle this in order to get widespread adoption. You have to have a compelling value proposition, and you have to remove these obstacles for people, these blockers. And there's potentially an argument that says that privacy is one of the blockers for the Internet of Things, particularly in the domestic domain. So we're not really at this point interested in factory automation and smart cities. We're thinking really more about IoT in the home and for mobile users. And there's a bunch of evidence that we could cite around privacy concerns and why people might care about privacy in this context. So just a couple of examples. This one is from a report in 2015 talking about consumers being anxious about companies selling their data. Right? And we can have an interesting discussion about who owns data, right? But they're worried that people are going to sell their data. And this is spread across all age groups. It's not just old people like myself and Satya. It's not just us who worry about it, right? There's a more general point that actually across the ages, people worry about what's going to happen to their data. And indeed, actually, if you look at sort of the various government reports, this is also true, that even if there isn't actually a significant privacy leak at some point, the concern, the worry that there could be, is enough to inhibit the adoption of the technology. So we think that there's some evidence, and other people are citing evidence around privacy in the IoT, and particularly privacy in domestic IoT being important, and that this is potentially a blocker for widespread adoption. So the question is, what can we do to try and address that? And we're predominantly systems people on this paper, and so we have a very kind of simple approach to this, very kind of simple mindset, which is what can we do at a sort of systems level to try and tackle this? And we start with a very, very simple principle, which is users should be able to control the release of their own data. I gave this presentation a couple of weeks ago in Washington at an IEEE forum around IoT and privacy. And we got into a long debate about who owns data and is it my data or is it some other random company's data. But I think if you talk to most users, they actually have quite a good intuitive grasp of what it is that is their data. If you put a sensor into their house, whether it's a thermostat, a smart TV, a fridge, whatever it is, to them, that's their data. It's not your data, even if you gave them the sensor on some kind of funky discounted pricing model, right? It's their data. It's about them and their family and their activities, and they would like to control it. So our basic sort of premise is very simple, that users should be able to control the release of their own data. And then the challenge becomes how you actually achieve that. And for us, again, you know, there's sort of no magic here. The idea was, well, we can do that by introducing this idea of sort of privacy mediators. So this says, whatever you put in my house, whatever kind of sensor you're going to put in my house, before it goes back to the cloud, I'd like the option to have a look at what it's sending back and tweak it, stop it, change it, redact it, whatever it is. I want the control of the release of that data from my house, from my environment, the data that relates to me. And I want that mediator, I want that sort of bit of privacy control that I'm going to have to run in my domain. So this basically comes from a sort of, I wouldn't say a paranoia, but it says, don't take the sensor data and ship it out to the cloud and then have the cloud do some funky filtering and funky processing. It says, no, actually, the sensor data is, the sensor's in my house, the sensor's in my environment, and so I want the control of that sensor, I want the mediator for that sensor to also be in my house, to also be under my control. And only once I've had a chance to adjust that data do I want it released into the cloud, because once it's released into the cloud, I'm sort of assuming it's gone. I'm kind of going, you know what, it's sort of game over. It's with somebody else, and my ability to control that becomes very limited. So once you sort of start to say, well, let's do this kind of mediation, let's try and think about what this privacy mediation might look like, you start to kind of come up with a set of requirements for these mediators. I'm just going to step through a few of these now. So the first thing is that in general, what you would like to be able to do is to both view the data that these sensors are sending out, but also then to be able to either delete or downsample that data, so to reduce the accuracy or to reduce the precision of that data so that it's easier for you to, not so much hide, but for you to control how much data is shipped out to the cloud. And you need to be able to support both deletion and reduction. You need this kind of idea of summarization of data, so both for kind of temporal and spatial data. And you can think of a sort of particular example around, say, energy reporting, where you might be entirely happy to share with an energy company data about your annual energy consumption or your weekly energy consumption, but you really don't want to share it at the day level or the hour level or the minute level. Right? So that would be a choice thing. And you wouldn't want to do that because as soon as you start to share data at that level of granularity, then the inference that people can draw from it then becomes significantly greater. Right, so you might want to choose how to summarize the data. And indeed, ideally, though, I mean, who knows how you would do this, right? Ideally, you'd like to be able to limit the inferences that people could draw from it. So you'd like to say, I don't mind you knowing energy data, but I don't want you inferring occupancy data from that. You know, I'm quite happy to share data about events in my, my smart TV, but I don't want you to infer which programs I'm watching or how many people are in front of the TV set. So, that's a challenge, right? How you limit the inference. But as a user, that's kind of what you would like to be able to do. You also, of course, want to be able to support mobility, because this isn't just about you and your environment. It's about, in your house, it's about you and your environment as you go out. So as we come into a space like this, or we go into a cafe, or we go into a meeting room, can I actually apply this same concept of privacy mediation to protect the data that's being captured about me? And of course, from a requirements perspective, right, you'd like this whole thing to be super easy to use so that people don't kind of walk away from it. So they're going to go, okay, well, actually, I can express some high-level goals about privacy mediation, and then those actually then translate into these components which will filter the sensor data for me. So at this point, we've got, in order to make the IoT work, we need to get over this privacy concern. In order to get over this privacy concern, we have a very simple design principle. The user maintains control of their data. And we're going to do that with privacy mediators. and here's a bunch of requirements for these mediators. So the basic design principle is that the user should be able to control release of their sensor data. They should have the first option, so before it gets into any other service, before it gets into the cloud, they get a chance to control the release. It's continuous control, not just sort of install time or configuration time control. In other words, we're not trying to create a system here in which we make it easy for people to set privacy preferences at the time you install an application. This isn't about that. It's more akin to something like a firewall, where you're actually filtering the traffic in real time, all the time, and you're making it possible to kind of adjust those privacy preferences or privacy constraints all of the time. Right? So it's always running, always protecting you, and you can always tweak it. And we think that because you want these privacy mediators to be under your control, it should be on kind of infrastructure that you actually also control. So again, it's not pushed out into the cloud. And of course, given the authors of the paper, right, it's no surprise that cloudlets kind of have this natural sort of role in this, right? So for those of you who don't know, cloudlets, you can think of them as sort of your own personal data center at the edge of the cloud. It can be owned by the cloud provider, but it can also be owned by you and acting as a place to host programs for your own benefit. And here you can sort of think of a cloudlet within your home, within your trust domain, that's actually kind of coincides with this natural boundary of trust and responsibility, and at which point you can run the mediators. And the key thing about this is that the cloudlets give you a way not just of making it easy for you to deploy these mediators, but also an infrastructure that supports the sort of the very high bandwidth sensors that we sort of foresee emerging. So sort of, for example, video cameras within the home. And actually the way that you would do mediation of those video streams requires some fairly sophisticated kind of processing, and cloudlets can give you that with a sort of nice scalable design. So simple architectural overview. What we have is a whole bunch of devices along the bottom, and some of these devices we're absolutely clear we're not going to be able to get to mediate. So we're not really expecting to get between your Fitbit and your healthcare provider. We don't really expect necessarily to be able to do that. So some data flows straight from the IoT device up into the cloud, and you're fine with that. You brought the Fitbit as a service, life's good. But for a whole range of other devices that you put, for example, in your home, actually, those you do want to be able to mediate. And in this case, the data, instead of going straight up into the cloud, comes via the cloudlet. The data gets stored, and we have to have a reasonable amount of storage on these cloudlets because we need to collect the data in order to be able to aggregate it and summarize it over time. So the data is stored. You have a series of privacy policies which say actually how you want to do the mediation. And then the privacy mediators themselves, which run on the cloudlet, implement a range of functions for reducing the data that's getting exported out. And then finally comes out of the privacy mediator and kind of goes off to the cloud. So a couple of use cases, because you might be thinking, well, OK, that sounds fine, but it sounds kind of heavyweight, really, for many applications. So the two scenarios that the authors have been thinking about, one is to do with technologies, particularly IoT technologies for sort of human augmentation. So this is augmented decision-making, augmented memory, these kinds of things, where you're collecting a lot of environmental data to then try and provide some kind of cognitive assistance to the user, and particularly sort of video data. That has the interesting property that you're moving around, so you're coming into new spaces, and you need the mediators to be present to process the data in those spaces. But also kind of omnipresent video, so just generally video cameras become an important element of the IoT. Those video streams coming back, you're not going to be able to process all of those back at the cloud. You're not going to want to stream all of that video back. You need to intercept it before it leaves your domain of control. And so the privacy mediators give you a good way of doing that. And in the poster session, Brandon will have a poster on OpenFace, which is an example of sort of public domain face recognition system that we can then use as a component of the mediator running on the cloudlet to actually start to process these video streams. And again, that type of technology you wouldn't run on the phone, you wouldn't run on your sensor, you wouldn't run out in the cloud, you need it somewhere else, and the cloudlet gives you that space. So the summary of this, and as I said, it's a pretty simple kind of proposition, really. IoT hitting a chasm. In order to address that, we need to address the privacy concerns. In order to really engage users, you have to have a very, very simple proposition for them. And the proposition that we're making is, we will let you control your data. Data that's captured in your space, your domain, you get the first chance to decide how much of that is released. And we support that by providing architectural support in terms of cloudlets and privacy mediators that run on top of those cloudlets. We don't have an implementation. As I said, no graphs. We don't have an implementation. But we have some pretty clear ideas about how these mediators need to be designed. And for quite a number of the different IoT sensors, it's really not trivial, but it's certainly possible to look at those and think, yes, I understand how I would build a mediator. And in particular, how I would build mediators that then run across different applications and different sensor types. And if you look in the paper, we also have a discussion around the implication of this for business models for the IoT, particularly in the domestic space. So with that, I'll leave you and say thank you very much indeed, and have a little plug that we're hiring as well. So if anyone's interested, get in touch. That's it. Thank you.